So is this going to be a predictable late cycle process with credit, then yields, and then equities peaking?
Well, look, I think that these things are never predictable. So all we can go by is both what do we think fundamentally and what has happened in history. And I think the interesting thing is that those actually line up. We think that the fundamentals in credit are the weakest, that it makes sense for credit to have already troughed in January. That's when we think the trough of credit spreads has occurred, and that equities would come after that, that equities would be the last thing to peak, that is a pretty usual pattern. And I think that fits with some of the one-off factors that are currently boosting equities, including a lot of optimism around the kind of one-time benefit from tax cuts.
What sort of timing are you looking at here, Andrew?
Sure. So, look, I think that the market has to get through a couple of different challenges. We think that certainly by the third quarter of this year, that's when we think the earnings revisions, the forward earnings for the S&P 500 stop going up. So as a kind of a later date, we think that the third quarter is a moment where we think that it would be difficult for the market to rally beyond that as the forward earnings would start to come down. But I think we also have to think about a nearer term environment where we're going to see PMIs declining, we're going to see inflation rising, we're going to see policy tightening. And historically, that's a pretty difficult time for the market. There's really not the worst combination for equity returns is PMIs declining and inflation going up. So we do think there's the potential that the S&P doesn't ultimately make its peak until the third quarter, but it's going to have to get through, we think, a pretty choppy summer environment.
Yeah, fascinating, Andrew. You say...
Andrew, you point to stock and bond correlations continuing to rise. How would you advise that investors diversify then in this scenario?
Yeah, so it's certainly going to be much harder because we've seen those correlations pick up. That's pretty common in other late cycle markets. That's probably especially true now given how low yields are and certainly how low they are outside the U.S. So I think there are a couple of strategies that we look at. I think currencies are very important. This is one reason why we like the yen. We think it's very reasonably valued, but it also provides very reliable diversification benefits. The dollar, even though it's not nearly as cheap, is also a pretty good and pretty reliable diversifier with positive carry. So certainly looking at that against some of the lower yielding currencies can be interesting. And I think it's also an environment where the economics of owning volatility are much better than they've been before, in part because the market has been more volatile. And so the cost of holding that volatility has been more manageable. So we do think that having strategies that are generally long volatility, that are owning volatility, make sense in far more markets than where they don't.